Welcome to the Byline Times interview, and I'm delighted to be joined by Richard Saunders, whose new film about Gaza, produced with Al Jazeera, lays bare what's happened in the last year since the October 7 attacks. Now, it's quite clear from Richard's film that the declared objectives of the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, last year to rescue the 250 or so hostages, to defeat Hamas, has not happened. But watching this extraordinary film, it seems like something else is taking its place. Now, Richard, can you just take me back how you came to make this film and the story behind the story? Because one of the key elements it reveals is the intent, the attitude of the tens of thousands of Israeli soldiers who've now entered Gaza. Tell me what you found and how you found it on social media, the actual behavior of the soldiers as they marched into the occupied territory of Gaza.
I mean, the origins of the film, first of all, I think like many people, just filled with a profound frustration of watching the way the conflict was being reported in Western media. Now, we have the great luxury, of course, that we don't just have to bang our heads against the wall. We can go out and make a proper film, which is what we did. So it's partly that. We'd made a film. So we did, first of all, we did October 7. So the first film, we did this in a way as a sequel to October the 7. We did a whole film about the events of October 7. And then, once that had gone to air, we were very struck by this phenomenon of social media postings by Israeli soldiers. Now, increasingly, I'm old enough that I did the Balkan Wars and Iraq and Afghanistan and so on. Increasingly, we've had this phenomenon of sort of user-generated content from soldiers. But that, they'd have a little handheld camera or something. I remember scurrying around with the invasion of Iraq and finding soldiers who had stuff. But now, of course, every single one of them has their phone. So there's that. They're all filming it. Even more remarkable, they're all loading it up straight onto their TikTok accounts, straight onto their Instagram accounts, straight on their Facebook. But most remarkable of all is they're not being stopped from doing this. The Israeli military and the Israeli government doesn't seem to have a problem with them putting this stuff up. And so we thought, well, here is a remarkable resource for telling this story, particularly since because of what they show. Now, I think what's interesting, first of all, is to talk about what they don't show. And there are thousands of these videos, literally thousands.
Yeah, there's like 2,000 counts you went through at least.
Well, we built up a database,
right,
of over 2,500 social media accounts, Instagram, TikTok, and so on. But within them, there are thousands of videos and photos. Now, what they don't show, or very, very, very rarely show, is combat.
With Hamas, presumably.
You very rarely see them actually fighting. Now, every now and then, you see them all standing there expending astonishing amounts of ammunition. But they're sort of standing up and there's nothing coming the other way. There's almost no actual combat in these soldiers' videos at all, which is remarkable. What there is deeply unflattering to the Israeli military. A lot of it shows pretty unpleasant behaviour. A thing we don't have in the film, there's an awful lot of jokes. There's a joke they do where they knock on a door, and there's no answer. They knock on the door, there's no answer. Camera pulls back, the house has been destroyed.
I've seen, Rarely on they had that.
Oh, and they do that again, and they never cease to find it funny. They never cease. And they also do mock estate agents tours, So an awful lot of spectacularly unfunny jokes,
at the expense of the destruction of Palestinian property.
Yes, very unfunny and very tasteless and unpleasant. You then have all this stuff of smashing houses up, and this very unpleasant obsession with women's underwear. They're obsessed with women's underwear. They're always dressing up in women's underwear and going through people's lingerie drawers. Now, then there's a sort of ascending scale. You then get the burning of houses. I would say the thing that you see more often than anything else is the detonation of buildings. I mean, and you have the footage of them laying the explosives. So when I was watching it, one of my editors had served in the Greek military, and he said what they're using there is anti-tank mines. And basically, they're using far more explosive than they need to blow up these buildings. They're competing for clicks.
And I've seen
We live in an era of technology And this has been described as the first live stream genocide in history, and I believe that to be true. They are conducting a genocide now with glee. They're setting their atrocities to music and putting them on catchy reels on TikTok. Ordinary Israelis see what their military is doing and celebrate it. It's not just fringe elements who see this and think it's a good thing.
And I see in the film, they are standing there smiling with a selfie and a huge building. And these are not just houses, are they? The hospitals, schools, civilian infrastructure is being blown up. So these, let's be clear to our audience, these are war crimes. You should not, it has to be proportionate. You should not be attacking civilians or civilian infrastructure. Why do you think they're allowed to post these? And what is the reaction of the Israeli public from what you can see from their shares and the reactions to it? Are they being encouraged? Are they being condemned? Or is this more of a collective thing that people are encouraging?
No, it's very much collective. And we show Israeli civilian social media and also Israeli media and also the statements of Israeli politicians. I think, in a way, the central point of the film is articulated by Susan Abulhawa, the Palestinian journalist, right at the beginning. No one can say they didn't know. Yeah. In the West, when people aren't overtly supporting the Israelis, they tend to have this discourse about it's complicated, it's nuanced, And I think the point of this film is listen to Israelis, to Israelis in their own voices. They don't think it's complicated. They don't think it's nuanced. They're talking about genocide. They're talking about ethnic cleansing. And no, it's not some obscure subculture. This is mainstream. And with the soldiers' videos, yes, we put lots of very unpleasant ones in the film. We didn't have to grub around to find them. They're all like that. They're all like that.
And we will go to that later, but the degree of unpleasantness mounts to depictions of torture, human shields.
And murder.
And murder.
And murder.
Just on the level of destruction, you say they're blowing up the villages, all buildings. There's a whole village, isn't there, which a battalion, if I recall, celebrates destroying every building in. So that is a command. That's not a random individual atrocity of an individual soldier. This looks like a policy. And I think we just, on Byline Times, we have a piece on this. 70 kilotons of munitions, of explosive have been launched, which is on Gaza.
That's just what's been dropped on Gaza.
No, we'll get to the bulldozers in a moment.
Yeah.
Oh, that's right. That's been dropped on Gaza, which is the equivalent of double Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So explain, it's not just what's dropped. It's not.
I mean, what we're watching in these films, it's by definition quite hard to film an actual sort of bomb landing because you don't know where it's going to land.
Yeah.
No, what we're watching in the film for the most part, and what you see in the videos for the most part, is detonations, buildings that have been rigged for explosion, which, as a number of people in the film point out, by definition, these buildings do not pose a threat. I mean, they did the same yesterday to a village in Lebanon. And it's the same thing. If you can go in and rig every building in a place with explosives, there's no one in the building. It's not a threat to you. And it gets to a point where it becomes wanton destruction, willful destruction. And yes, as you say, it's a war crime. It's a war crime.
So, there are war crimes, collective punishment, disproportion. Looking at your film, would it be fair to say there's something bigger going on, or to assume? For example, another extraordinary fact that came out was that 40 million cubic tons of rubble have been created in the last year in Gaza, in the most densely populated part on Earth, or one of the most densely populated parts of the world, which will take 15 years to clear. Now, you'll correct me, the precise thing they said, but the International Criminal Court said that the Israeli army had a tendency, towards genocide.
Plausible genocide. It's
plausible.
The ICJ, the International Court of Justice. Yeah.
Blocks getting blown up, universities getting blown up.
Yes!
It's just extraordinary. This is willful destruction. The fact that they've been able to rig these buildings up with explosives shows very clearly that there's no current threat from those buildings.
There's no justification for destroying a structure if the enemy isn't in it.
I asked an IDF officer in late 2023 why they were blowing up and destroying buildings, especially civilian infrastructure across Gaza that clearly has no military value and has no link to active fighting. And he said basically that it's an act of punishment by destroying every sort of infrastructure, any link, any reference to Hamas. Anything that Hamas has touched will be destroyed.
But it hadn't come to a conclusion. There's a tendency towards they were looking out for that. Though it's a very contentious word, requires intent, requires, as we know in Bosnia and we're having the Srebrenica, quite a lot of supportive evidence to definitively say genocide is taking place. Could we assume from this massive destruction there's something akin to ethnic cleansing?
Certainly. I mean, I find it a slightly arid debate about whether genocide is taking place or not. I mean, it's very semantic, and it seems to me the actual definition of genocide is slightly random anyway. But, suppose ultimately they decide it's not technically genocide. They've murdered over 15,000 children. That is a monstrous crime regardless of what you call it. Now, what are they doing? What are the aims? Okay, as you say, originally the aim was to defeat Hamas and to liberate the hostages. Now it became very clear very early on, above all to the families of the hostages, that they had no intention of releasing the hostages. That was very, very far down their list of priorities.
And there were lots of discussions apparently with Hamas about truces or ceasefires, which have been ignored.
That's right. Well, Hamas wants in order to release the rest of them, it wants a proper ceasefire. I mean, that's their condition. I mean, the Hamas ended up. October the 7th got rather out of control, and very, very real crimes were committed on October the 7th. They also ended up with a lot of sort of children and old people and so on that they didn't really want. So they gave, I think, the vast majority of them back when there was the truce last autumn. Now, defeating Hamas, to defeat Hamas, you've got to go down in the tunnels.
Yes, the film portrays very clearly, both you're very clear about the atrocities on October the 7th, any mitigation of what Hamas did, but you also show some combat from Hamas's point of view, which is them emerging from tunnels underneath this rubble and shooting at Israeli tanks. You feel that so there's a war going on underground which the Israelis aren't engaging in.
Well, yes, I mean, there's a stark contrast between Israeli soldiers' videos, which are basically them dressing up in women's underwear and what have you, and Hamas videos. Now, Hamas videos, of course, these are propaganda videos. They're carefully edited. They show us what they want to show, and presumably there are plenty of missions which fail, which they don't make the cut. Yeah. But nevertheless, there's over 300 of them out there, and you can see. They're inflicting damage. I think very often they get a big bang. I think very often their weaponry does not penetrate the armour. I think what they get is what you call a mobility kill. Right. They put the tank out of action. The crew inside are perhaps injured, but the death toll is about 350 for Israeli soldiers.
350 Israeli soldiers.
Which is actually, when you've looked at the Hamas videos, is surprisingly small. Right. But I think there's a lot of injured.
Yes. What are the Hamas? Do we know? Because one of the allegations is this 42,000 civilian casualties in Gaza. People say, well, a lot of them are Hamas militants. I mean, is that plausible?
Well, if they are Hamas militants, it's because they, by chance, they were killed when a whole bunch of other people were killed. Right. I don't think they're being killed during combat. I mean, I would say a very simplistic, common sense thing. If you look at these thousands of videos put out by Israeli soldiers, and also the very large number of videos put out by the IDF, the Israeli army, look for dead fighters. Look for pictures of dead fighters, and of course they have no compunction about pointing the camera at dead fighters once they've got them. And there are some, but remarkably few.
Wow,
remarkably few.
I mean, the other argument is I'm just putting, what people say is, well, Hamas hide. They're using the Gazan population as human shields. What's the answer to that?
Well, I think this is terribly important, and I think this is where one of the areas, and we spend quite a lot of time on this in the film because it matters, and I think this is one of the areas where the Western media is appallingly culpable. Now, Hamas shares a very small patch of land with the civilian population. Beyond that, I'm not quite sure what people mean by using the population as human shields. They're certainly not sort of hiding behind them. I mean, we have studies on this from past conflicts. I think in the last conflict in 2014, they managed to find one instance where they'd fired rockets from next to an apartment building without telling the people. But I mean, the idea that they're sort of sticking a body there, apart from anything else, just use a common sense thing here again. What is there about Israeli behavior in the last year that would lead you to think that the use of a human shield, a Palestinian civilian, would lead them to hold fire? Absolutely nothing. There would be no purpose to it whatsoever. Also, Hamas, whatever else one thinks of them, is a movement rooted in the people. It's a popular movement, and now I think the feelings of people towards Hamas in the Gaza Strip are very complicated. Now, on the whole, I think they tend to support the fighters. They support the resistance, and that would
they call it the resistance rather than Hamas when it's mentioned, the armed resistance.
Yeah, the resistance. Yeah, well, that's how Palestinians would all see it. And that would very quickly cease to be the case if they were holding old ladies in front of them, and also these are their cousins, their uncles, their aunts. It doesn't really make sense. Now, it's absolutely exasperating, this, because you could pay a 22-year-old half an hour's research and he'd get this, or she would get this. There is no evidence for this whatsoever. On the other hand, there is abundant evidence that the Israelis systematically use Palestinian civilians as human shields, and in the crudest way. And we've got footage in our film. The guy's walking down the street holding him, and he's got this gun rested on his shoulder.
And going into buildings where they think their minds semi-naked.
I mean, it was an interesting thing. We have a few accounts in the film from people who've been used as human shields. We gathered 6 testimonies in all of people who'd been used as human shields. Now, in each of those cases, we hadn't approached that person because we heard they'd been used as a human shield. We were talking to them about something else.
Right.
Coincidentally, they'd been used as a human shield. It's clearly absolutely systematic, and it really is criminal the way the Western media just totally misreports this. And this isn't a thing about what point of view you're coming from and so on. It's just basic journalism. It's just basic facts. And I did an interview with a Palestinian journalist the other day, and we were talking about this, and at the end he said, yes, it's journalism that kills. And he's absolutely right. It's journalism that kills.
The other thing that's sort of said more in this Israeli media, Israel has some great media, Haaretz does great reporting, is that there is a massive support for Hamas in Gaza. But the last election, I think, was 2006, wasn't it? And there hasn't been an election since. And also, we're not in a place where a opinion poll can be taken. But that leads to collective punishment again, isn't it? If you think people support, that justifies the killing of children. If you think,
yes, I mean, the attitude of people towards Hamas is complicated, and even more complicated now. Even there, I mean, another Palestinian friend said to me once, one of the difficulties of a situation that the Palestinians find themselves in is politics becomes very simple. Yeah. In the end, Palestinians are essentially faced with a single political choice. Do you resist or do you not resist? And most, whether it be via Hamas or the methods Hamas uses or whatever, but most Palestinians support resistance.
Of course, now massive displacement, ongoing attacks on hospital facilities, a terrible attack, patients burnt to death recently in northern Gaza. Why is, just on a practical level first, before we get to the more ideological or sort of geopolitical one, why is the mainstream media, particularly in the UK and US, so bad at covering this? Is there a problem? Coming to the screening of your film, we had some amazing Palestinian journalists who actually said, why don't you trust us? Why don't you cover our material? And there's a technical problem there, isn't it? I mean, Western news organizations like an audit trail, like to know who's, sort of confirmation. Do you think that's a legitimate excuse? I mean, Al Jazeera manages to produce
No, not really. I mean, if we take attacks on hospitals, attacks on UN schools, or let's take starvation as a weapon of war. The various agencies are in there, various aid agencies, various human rights organizations have done studies. It is massively, abundantly clear the Israelis are using starvation as a weapon of war. Human Rights Watch certainly has reached that very, very firm and very clear conclusion, and it's for Western media, in the name of impartiality and balance, to continue to present this issue as if it's 50-50 is absurd and amounts to complicity. And they wouldn't do it in any other context when the evidence is so massively, overwhelmingly clear that the Israelis are doing this. Now, why Western media is so bad, that's an enormous topic.
Well, one before we get to that enormous topic, there are we've had several, we had 5 or 6 journalists in reporting to us from Ukraine. It's impossible to get a Western, a BBC or yourself.
Oh, you can't get in there. No, but I mean,
I'm not using that excuse, but there's that's one technical.
Yes, I know, but I mean, the with, say, starvation as a weapon of war, or the issue of whether Hamas is using hospitals to build bases. The evidence is massively, overwhelmingly clear. The reason the West is not reporting this clearly is not because it doesn't have journalists in there. And also, there are an awful lot of Palestinian journalists.
I was going to say, why don't they trust?
Well, exactly. Why? I mean, we obviously we exercise scrutiny and rigor when we're looking at clips. Every now and then you'll look at a clip, and particularly, I work with Palestinians, and they'll look at it and say, I avoid that one, and that there looks like a slightly dodgy edit there, and so on. But in general, if you are looking at a devastated landscape and shredded bodies on the floor, what do you think you're looking at? It's not a movie set.
And of course, you have you worked for Al Jazeera as a freelancer on this movie, and there are Al Jazeera journalists in Gaza. Let's have a look at a tragic clip of what happened to the family of one of those journalists.
Hello, I'm Nick Clark. This is the News Hour live from Doha. Our colleague from Al Jazeera Arabic has just learned that his wife and other members of his family have been killed in an airstrike. The entire team here in Doha is offering our sincere condolences.
The family of Wael Dahtu, Al Jazeera's Gaza bureau chief, is killed in a strike on the Nusayrat refugee camp in central Gaza, supposedly part of the safe zone south of the Gaza River Valley. The family had evacuated from the north of the Strip.
The attack resulted in the killing of Wael's wife, his daughter Sham, his son Mahmoud, his grandson Adam, and the injury of other family members. For him to be targeted, for his family to be targeted, it's very devastating for us as journalists. For us, it felt like that red line being crossed.
At the end of October, Yumna El Sayed's own family is still in Gaza City, in the north of the Strip.
So there's an example, Richard, of a legitimate journalism Al Jazeera is trusted and being deliberately targeted.
Yeah, and so yes, I mean, it's not just Palestinians working for small organisations; it's Al Jazeera, and yes, they've killed 4 people working for us. And, I've said this in a number of interviews. You and I, we've reported from dodgy places and what have you, and sometimes it's a bit scary and what have you. I mean, has it ever occurred to you in your life that they might murder your children?
No.
No, I mean, it just doesn't enter our minds, whereas they do. And you look at Wael Dahtu there, the family had left the north as they were told to. They were in the supposed safe zone. We have Yumna El Sayed's account as well, certainly of her family being threatened. And it's just, and so yes, I mean, I think that's the other side of this call continually for Western journalists to be allowed in. So you're saying you don't believe Arabs, and Al Jazeera has a very high reputation. And Al Jazeera reports things very carefully, no one can say they didn't know. We can't pretend we didn't know just because there weren't white people in there telling us,
And obviously, this film is out there now, but will we see it on mainstream media? I saw the screening. You contacted me. People can say People say you can't say you didn't know, but how many of the British public know about this, or the American public? Tell us about your experience of trying to get this film on air and these messages across to a wider audience.
Well, it's extraordinary, isn't it? I mean, I've done 3 films for Al Jazeera now, all of which, the first one on Jeremy Corbyn and anti-Semitism, the second one October the 7th, and then this. All of them presenting a narrative which is at odds with the mainstream narrative. And I've never encountered anything like it. I'm not prone to conspiracy theories or anything like that, but it is astonishing, the absolute omerta. You cannot break through. There is an absolute determination not to reference us. Now, the thing is, it's very different now from 30 or 40 years ago. You have social media,
right.
And they can't suppress it. And the films we do for Al Jazeera are very widely watched and very widely commented on. And in the long run, I think it does harm to mainstream media because various of the films we've done have revealed things, and mainstream media just carries on as if they haven't revealed them. But there's enough people out there who notice that this is happening. And for example, if you look at the opinion polling for trust in the BBC, it's terrifying, the fall off in the last 20 years. Now, I think there's a whole range of reasons for that, some of which aren't the fault of the BBC. But this sort of thing doesn't help when you're just sort of...
The BBC, to be fair, and we've run an article on that by Des Freeman, gets constantly criticised by pro-Israeli academics that it's somehow pro-Palestinian.
Yes, I know, but that reflects a point of view where they simply want it to be a mouthpiece for Israeli propaganda. I mean, I think the BBC has been a particular problem. I mean, I think one thing we avoid doing in the film is both sidesism. Yeah. Okay, if you have on the one side a situation where, on October 7th, 2 Israeli babies were killed, which is a terrible thing. At this stage, it's very likely that more than 1,000 children under 1 have been killed. Now, if you are presenting those things equally, you're engaging in a racist arithmetic, and that isn't balance. Now, what the BBC does, and what Western media does on the whole, is equivalence and balance in that sense, which we don't buy into. I think actually with the BBC it's actually worse than that. Actually, I think the BBC has been very bad. It's not even balanced in that sense very often with the BBC's coverage. And the BBC is bullied, and it allows itself to be bullied.
And they have a phrase, due impartiality. They changed impartiality to due impartiality after, I think, that furore over Nigel Lawson, one climate change denier, and one climate
which Emily Maitlis talks about.
So there's something beyond just due impartiality here. Now, this is where we get quite difficult territory because there are various factors going on. I mean, what people describe it, I mean, obviously in the global south, as it were, this sort of anomaly is seen in Western media. And it's sometimes described as classic apartheid situation and a colonial situation, white settlers as well. Obviously, you're looking with a slightly longer historical lens. These so-called white settlers, and a lot of Israelis aren't particularly white, were themselves victims of white supremacy. So we have a complex... Is that part of the problem, that sort of... the moral complexity? How can victims of the Shoah, victims of this discrimination, become discriminators themselves?
Yeah. I mean, the terrible complexity and tragedy, really, of the Zionist project is that it is both the product, in part anyway, the product of appalling, unspeakable racism, but also a source of appalling, unspeakable racism. Now, yes, of course, the origins of Zionism are more complicated than the origins of colonialism elsewhere in the world. But in terms of the people it is inflicted upon, it is no different at all. It's exactly. In fact, it's worse because it's granted leeway.
More immunity.
It's granted. That's right. It's granted a level of impunity. I mean, just look at what has been done to Gaza in the last year. The apartheid government in South Africa never did anything like that. And all of the world's leading human rights organizations, including B'Tselem, which is Israeli, define Israel as an apartheid state. I mean, what is it? Avoid sort of throwing around political terms, but what is it? Why do we object to settler colonial states? What's the objection? Why at the end of the 20th century did we decide these are bad things and shouldn't happen? And it's because they're characterized by two things. They have societies which are characterized by a racist contempt for the culture, the history, often the religion of the indigenous people, and political structures structured to ensure the domination of the incoming group. Now, if that is the definition of a settler colonial society, Israel is definitely a settler colonial society. And I think, okay, we come at it from the point of view of our own complexity, our own enormous historical baggage. But we have no right to impose that on an entirely blameless people from the developing world. We sort of franchise out our guilt. And it's monstrous that we do that. It's monstrous.
Is another factor. I mean, we talk about geopolitics and these grand alliances, which sometimes make no sense. It always strikes me as very, very odd that there's a lot of connections between Putin and Israel and Netanyahu and oligarchs, given that obviously Putin is close to Iran, which supports Hamas and Hezbollah, and yet he's somehow close to these oligarchs. And obviously that leads to this anomalous position for Ukrainians. They see Iran as an enemy, as in alliance with Putin and Russia, and therefore sort of may more likely take Israel's side in this conflict. But why does the US and the UK, why has it placed its flag so firmly in Israel as an island? As you know, my friend Tony Judd sadly died 10 years ago, served in the IDF, was saying it was becoming a rogue state. Is that partly because of politics in the Middle East and the Arab and the non-Arab world, like Iran and Saudi Arabia? What is or is it because Jerusalem's the center of three world religions?
I think there's a whole bunch of things. I mean, it's an American aircraft carrier in the Eastern Mediterranean. Then there's a whole bunch of things. But you can add all of those things together, and that provides an explanation. Even then, it doesn't provide a complete explanation. I mean, it seems to be in the long run that the way this very small racist ethno-state holds the Western media and political establishment in thrall is very damaging. I mean, it totally undermines us morally. I mean, I don't think people in the West realize the degree to which we have destroyed the concept of universal human rights, the rule of law. And so it also buggers up our relationship with about a third of the world. It's impossible to overstate how much resentment Palestine generates in the Muslim world.
Just back to Israel. So you say a racist ethno-state. Maybe you could say since the new right-wing government has become so, and of course 25% of the population of Israel are Arab, aren't they? Of Christian.
I think it's about 20%.
Yeah. So there's more discrimination. But Israelis might say, well, we are a democracy. None of the surrounding states
because they ethnically cleanse the territory. I mean,
this. A good answer. And it wasn't always this way. I remember going to Israel before Rabin was assassinated, and there was hope there that there could be a two-state solution, or as Tony Judd...
Well, we're getting into sort of big issues here. I mean, a Palestinian would say that there was never a nice, benign Zionism. The root of Zionism is the ethnic cleansing of 75%, 80% of the Palestinian population. And essentially thereafter, we reward Israel for that by saying it's a democracy. I mean, having totally engineered the demographics to ensure a majority, yes, they're then a democracy. As was South Africa. I mean, if they
Bantustans and all that.
Yeah, they allowed all white people had the vote,
But Richard, all that...
But there is a big...
Yeah, no, topic, all that being a debate about history and, spin and interpretations of history which are favourable to somebody or else another. It's a bigger question to end on, really. When these positions are so polarized, and I do understand, I'm not sure I'd agree that all Zionism has to manifest itself like this. Other forms of Zionism which express a slightly more peaceful outcome.
Well, Zionism doesn't have to require racial hegemony.
No, exactly.
In practice, it always has demanded that, though. Now, there may be other types, and I think one day Israel will have to discover another type, but Palestinians understandably relate to Zionism as it has always been imposed, and it has always been imposed as a regime of racial supremacy.
Well, that's was a question I was going to say. Where does this lead in the end? I mean, the balance of populations, if you look at Israeli Jews, Arab Israelis, West Bank and Gaza, you have, one side has overwhelming firepower and munition and even nuclear weapons, but in population terms, this isn't an easy...
It's still 50-50.
It's still 50-50. So apart from one side killing the other, which, though attempts might be made, looks, absolute eradication looks unlikely. How do you see this coming to some conclusion?
It's dreadful. It's very bleak, and this is why I say the West has to wean itself off support. I think one day it might come to be seen that we've been very bad friends to Israel and that we did indulge it. I mean, one having covered situations around the world and also done history and so on. One thing I would say is the problem with colonial situations is if you have a subject people who are being told they have to live as despised second-class citizens in their own land, no people ever resigns themselves to that.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not a very aggressive, militaristic sort of person. You just have to spend time at a checkpoint in the West Bank to get it. You can never, ever resign yourself to that. Now, they might beat old sods like you and me into submission eventually, but there's always another bloody 18-year-old coming through. A people never resigns itself to that. The only situations where they have, where they are effectively exterminated, Australian Aboriginals, American,
maybe Uyghurs in East
yes,
Turkmenistan.
perhaps,
Yeah.
American, American Indians and so on. And so in all of these situations, the situation is simple. You have to grant Palestinians civil, political, and human rights and respect as human beings. Now, thereafter, whether you have a single democratic state or two states, or whatever, that it all becomes much easier to resolve if you're not demanding the domination of one ethnicity. Once you just accept it's a multi-ethnic territory where everyone has equal rights, then all sorts of solutions are possible. But that's it's not really that complicated. It's just as in South Africa, the problem was apartheid and the solution was ending apartheid. The problem in Israel is the demand for ethnic hegemony, and the solution is to end that. Richard,
thanks for talking to me. I urge everybody to watch his film, which I think you can download if you go to the Al Jazeera site, look for Gaza. But great to hear about your next projects when you're working on them. And thanks for being so illuminating and tell us the story behind the story, how you made this extraordinary documentary.
Thank you very much.